My name is Anna Griffin and I'm from the Australian Red Cross. And I think some of you might be thinking, why on earth is the Red Cross here? I'm sure you all know Red Cross from bloods and floods, but of course Red Cross is also considered to be the guardians of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war. And the founder of our movement was really key in establishing the first Geneva Convention as well. So we're also really have a big role to play in educating the public and people who are likely to need to use the laws of war, whether they go to war or if they're NGOs or in the armed forces. So we promote the respect and understanding of the law as well. I've probably got way too much in this presentation, so I'm going to try and skip through it as quickly as I can to get through in the time. So why international humanitarian law? Well, I guess first and foremost because conduct in war is not unlimited. There are rules that regulate warfare, and there are also consequences for people that break those rules. And there's an obligation for states and the Red Cross to educate people on the laws of war. And we also think that video games can be a really great and potentially powerful tool to do this sort of work as well. And there's been some discussion of that already today. So, of course, video games are not played in the real world, so why is the Red Cross interested? Well, I think there's a real potential to increase the realism of games by including an international humanitarian law framework. It's not at all about sanitising games. I mean, the decisions that soldiers make in war are complicated and difficult. It's about presenting a scenario that's realistic. There's a really great article, if you're interested in reading it, on why the Red Cross is involved in these issues, and that's listed there. So I think ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has actually been working with Bohemia Interactive over the last few years to try and come up with some video games, I guess, to incorporate some of the aspects of war situations and some of the dilemmas that soldiers face, to include them in the games. And they're really trying to push for this idea of the use of force being represented in a realistic way on the battlefield. And the ICRC's opinion is really that gamers should be rewarded for respecting the laws, but there should be penalties as well for serious violations. But of course, not limiting people from being able to commit those violations. It's also an educational tool in itself. I'm going to skip through that. So what is international humanitarian law? It's a body of rules that applies in armed conflict, and it protects those who are not or who are no longer participating in hostilities. So that's both civilians, but also soldiers who are injured or who are prisoners of war. And the other aspect of international humanitarian law is that it limits the means and methods of warfare. So it's both the types of weapons that can be used, but also the way in which they can be used. So, for example, white phosphorus is a weapon that is probably not fit for use in civilian areas. It creates horrific damage to bodies. It burns through skin, it burns right through to bone. But in and of itself, it's not necessarily prohibited if you use it in a situation that is not in a built-up civilian area. There are other weapons like dum-dum bullets. They explode when they enter the flesh, and they're considered to cause unnecessary suffering, and they're outright prohibited. So a major part of IHL is found in the Geneva Conventions. There's 4 of them, and then the additional protocols as well. So the 4 Geneva Conventions relate to international armed conflict, which was how the wars were fought back in the day when these rules were first put together. But of course now, war is much more non-international in nature, a lot more civil wars going on. So we also have the 2nd additional protocol that relates to non-international armed conflict, and Common Article 3, which is through all 4 of the Geneva Conventions that also relate to non-international armed conflict. There's over 90 other IHL treaties. There are some of them listed there. A lot of them are about means and methods of warfare, so certain prohibited weapons like landmines, cluster munitions, prohibited conduct, so we've got the Genocide Convention as well. But it's a huge body of law, as you can see. I wanted to put this one in because I am actually not a gamer at all, but I've heard from friends that there are certain games that allow you to pretend to be a Red Cross and launch an attack from the cover of being a Red Cross, which is actually protected in war. And doing so is actually a war crime. These symbols in times of war, the cross, the crescent and the crystal, they all mean don't shoot. They all mean exactly the same thing, that the person who is using that symbol is providing neutral and impartial relief in times of war. So some of the fundamental questions that are looked at in international humanitarian law, it's about how the war must be fought, who must be spared from the fighting, and what are the rights and responsibilities of those participating in the fighting and those that aren't. So, as I've said, the means and methods are not unlimited. Warfare mustn't cause unnecessary suffering, and perfidy is forbidden. So that's that pretending to be a protected person or feigning surrender and using that to trick your opponent and into launch your attack from there. That's prohibited in times of war. In fact, doing so with the Red Cross emblem is actually a war crime as well. So it has that added element of prohibition. And torture is also forbidden. These are the main principles of international humanitarian law. Distinction, so this is the idea that attacks must always distinguish between civilian and combatant, and that's both civilian and people and property. Military necessity is the idea that attacks must have a definitive advantage. You can't just attack anything, shoot up everything, bomb everything. There has to be a concrete military advantage in doing so as well. So it's this idea there's no free rein. Proportionality, which has already been discussed, is this idea that damage to civilians must not outweigh the direct and concrete military advantage anticipated from an attack. And I think sometimes the idea of proportionality is quite easy to see. So you can't say bomb a whole city to kill one general. But sometimes it's a little bit more tricky. So can you take out this weapons factory over here that's surrounded by civilian buildings? It's not so clear-cut, it's not so easy to work out. There are difficult questions to answer. And unnecessary suffering, which is it's about attacks or weapons that are not justified by military utility or because the utility is outweighed by the suffering that is caused. So who must be spared from the fighting? Well, it's civilians, and that includes the local population, international aid workers, NGOs, refugees or internally displaced people, journalists, Red Cross workers, or people providing humanitarian assistance. Combatants who are auto combat, so prisoners of war or because they're injured or sick. And military, medical and religious personnel, they're also not to be targeted. So in armed conflict, you have combatants and they have a particular privilege. Basically, it's the idea that during a war, if you're a combatant, then you're allowed to kill people and it's not murder. You haven't committed an offence. As long as you're following the laws of war, that is perfectly acceptable under the law of armed conflict. So members of national armed forces have this combatant privilege. And also non-state armed groups as well that have an organised command structure, that have visible distinguishable sign like a uniform or insignia, that they carry arms openly, and of course that they're able to follow and respect the laws of war. They also have this combatant privilege. So I guess the way that we work out who a civilian is in the law of armed conflict is basically anyone who's not a combatant. It's defined in the negative. So in the international armed conflict, anyone who's not a party of the armed forces or a party to the conflict or a participant on a levée en masse. So a levée en masse is civilians who spontaneously take up arms to confront an invading force. In non-international armed conflict, so it's those who are not a member of the state armed forces or organised armed groups of a party to the conflict. Within this category of combatant, there's this idea of continuous combat function, that if you're a combatant, you're targetable all the time. You're targetable when you're sleeping, you're targetable when you're making your dinner. If you're in an armed forces, if you're in the military, you're always targetable. So here's a quick sort of snapshot of the rights and responsibilities. So the core idea really is that civilians are not to be targeted. Combatants can be. Combatants also have the combatant privilege. They're able to partake in the war. I guess the responsibilities for the combatants is that they have to respect the laws of war. But for civilians, they lose their privilege, their protected status if they do take part in the fighting. So in the conventions, there's this phrase that comes up: civilians shall enjoy the protection of the conventions unless and for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities. So basically, there's no prohibition or privilege against civilians doing so. It just means that they're now, if you do take up arms, that you are able to be targeted, that you can become part of the fair game or the fight. But of course, normal IHR considerations apply. You still have to follow the laws of war. Those things, the distinction, military necessity, proportionality, unnecessary suffering. So what about breaches? So in the conventions, states, so all the countries that have signed up to them, which is everybody in the world essentially, have an obligation to investigate and prosecute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And they're conveniently listed in the conventions as to what they are. And they include things like targeting civilians, excuse me, indiscriminate attacks, perfidious use of the Red Cross emblem. So I've seen, like in James Bond films, where they come down in a helicopter and come with a Red Cross on it and come jumping out and shooting people. That's a war crime. Willful killing, torture, inhumane treatment, destruction of property, which is not justified military means and carried out unlawfully. So I think we see examples of this happening all the time in our popular culture, in movies, in video games, in books. But they're considered grave breaches and they're war crimes and they can be punished. So first and foremost, states have an obligation to punish these violations domestically, and they do so through military tribunals or domestic courts. And in fact, the UK has undertaken some of these sort of trials domestically over the last couple of years for conduct in Afghanistan and Iraq. And people do face consequences. So there's a British JAG who's been charged and convicted with murder, and he's now appealing that conviction for conduct in Afghanistan. So states do take this really seriously and do follow these things up. The other way that crimes can be punished is through the International Criminal Court. So about 10 years ago now, or just over 10 years ago now, we had the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and which is charged with prosecuting these 4 crimes, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression, which is still yet to be defined. But so war crimes are of course defined by grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions found in the conventions that we already talked about. But crimes against humanity and genocide, they can also they don't have to happen in wartime. They can be in peacetime as well. Crimes against humanity has this concept of a widespread and systematic attack. So it has to be quite a large scale sort of violations, and they're listed in their sorts of crimes that can be considered crimes against humanity. Genocide is also, the particular acts that can be considered genocide are listed in the ICC statute. It has this added, I guess, hurdle. It has to, there has to be an intent to destroy in whole or in part an entire group under genocide. So it's quite a high bar to reach to be convicted of that crime. How does the ICC work? Well, because states first and foremost have the obligation to look after their own breaches, try them through their own courts, there's this idea of complementarity. So the ICC will only prosecute crimes that states are genuinely unwilling or unable to prosecute themselves. There's this idea that anybody can be prosecuted, individuals, commanders, heads of state. It's not, it doesn't, anyone really who's part of the fighting can really be prosecuted. And And so cases can go before the ICC by state referral, so people who have signed up to it who are parties can send states there, or the UN Security Council resolution can get a case to the International Criminal Court. It's quite difficult to in practice for cases to get there. The most serious violations will only ever get to this court, not just any old violations. But it does mean that there's less impunity now in the international arena for gross violations.